Hi and welcome back to Bike Speeds. So this week we're going to fully restore this 1988 Rally Eclipse 12. This is running on Reynolds 501 tubing. It's a 23.5 inch, which in its day was a medium frame size. And with this video we're going to put in new wheel bearings. We're going to put in new bearings in the 6-speed block, which is quite a comprehensive little service in itself, so watch that when it comes through. We're going to put new bottom bracket bearings in. We were actually able to get both cups out of this bike, which can be unusual on these older bikes, but we were able to get everything fully serviced there. We're going to put in new headset bearings, and you'll be amazed the difference we made to the bright work on that in itself. We're going to put in new derailleur cables, new brake cables. We're going to put a new chain on this. This bike didn't even have a chain on it when it arrived. We're going to put a new chain, and being only a 6-speed block, often the chains you get for those are cheap and nasty, but we've got a nice chain going on this. We're putting new tyres on. We're going to replace the inner tubes. We're going to polish it. We're going to wax it, and we're going to ceramic coat it. And I think as this video progresses, you will be amazed at what you can do with an old bike without fully repainting and fully restoring. I love this kind of work. This is one of my favourite jobs to do, where we recommission a bike and keep as much of the originality as possible. A bike can only be original once. Once you paint it or swap out parts for new parts, new old stock, you've lost the originality. This bike will be as new but as original as possible by the time we've finished. So first of all, we're going to strip off everything, which is what we're beginning to do here. So we get all the groups set off. We literally strip the frame right back to frame only, and then everything else we will then service and clean and bring up as best as we possibly can to make the bike look as new. So you can see from these brakes how dry and dusty, and everything's got a little bit of corrosion on it, maybe where it's sat a little bit damp at some time in its life. And we clean all these bits up, and they will absolutely pop out once they go back on the bike. You can see on the frame itself little bits of rust, little bits of spray of debris of grease and oils. We'll clean all that up along the way. We're going to get this chain set off, and you can see from this that it's actually not had an awful lot of wear, but this bike has just sat damp somewhere at some point in its life, and we're going to make sure that's all spot on when we finish building the bike back up. So off comes the chain set. We then get this bottom bracket off. Now this side will often come undone quite easily because it is an adjuster for the bearing itself, so that will come out, but this one is often a nightmare to get out. You'll see that in our other restoration videos where often we leave this cup in, but in this case we were able to get that out, which means we can clean up the threads and we can clean up the cup itself. You can see these old bearings, all the grease has dried out of those, so that's all going to need to be re-greased and sorted out. We actually put new bearings in there, and that will all work perfectly, and you'll see we do a little spin test on that further in the video. It's just incredible the way those old bottom brackets spin. Now this actually had an internal routed rear brake cable. That's probably an early incarnation of internal routing, really. Through the top tube there, the cable outer went through that top tube, so that was nice to see. And we actually used a Park Tool cable guide in there, which we just sat inside the frame while we were doing the work to help us put the new cable back in. Now we're stripping down the derailleur. You can see the debris on those wheels, which suggests the bike has been well used at some point in its life. But we'll clean all those wheels up, we'll clean the derailleur up. Same with the chain set, we'll get all that apart, clean it all up. You can see here in our ultrasonic cleaner, we've put fresh cleaner in this for this video, just so as you can see when we switch this on, you can see that cloud plume, and that's how good an ultrasonic cleaner is at pulling out the dirt from the parts that you put in it. It agitates those at an ultrasonic wave level, which is like just using a little scrubbing brush on all the parts. It just brings off the dirt and debris. They are great for cleaning up parts like this derailleur because it really gets deep in where you cannot get with a brush, but because it's an ultrasonic wave agitating that, it'll draw all that dirt and debris out of those parts way better than you could do just by hand and just by water alone. So we wash everything down. We're just using soapy water there because it's a water-based degreaser that we use, so we just wash it off and the parts just absolutely pop out. Some of the rust you still have to deal with. In this case we're using a brass bristle wire brush there, and we also use quite a bit of wire wool along the way, which you'll see at certain points. That'll just get the surface rust off of any parts that have still got it on. But look at these cups, look how beautiful those threads still are, and the surfaces and everything, and the cups themselves were as new, and they just clean up beautifully, those parts. Wash down the pedals. Actually the bearings on these, they span nicely and they didn't feel dry, so I didn't tackle the pedals on this one. We were doing so much other work involved with this bike that I often leave pedals alone, because it's often cheaper and more cost effective just to replace them. They're one of those parts that are quite interchangeable. If they needed the bearings doing down the line in due course with servicing, we can deal with that, but for this restoration we decided to actually just leave those pedals alone. So now we're just re-greasing all parts on the derailleur. We've greased the jockey wheels there. We're now just putting it back together. A little bit of Loctite on the bolts just to stop those coming off. We even lubricate things like the thumb adjuster here, because that actually had seized in the part when it came in, but we just lubricate those. That just makes them smooth. You can see there we've got our grease stand. A lot of people mention that in the comments. We're actually trialing this at this stage. We're hoping to bring this to market to you at some point, but actually these syringes we found are too big. They're too big for my hand to push them down comfortably and get a nice smooth actuation with them. So we've actually now got some other syringes we're just trialing. We'll get that absolutely spot on so as we know they work before we bring them to market, but keep an eye out. We'll be offering that as something you can buy from us. So we're just lubricating up the brakes, and we're getting that all back together and looking nice. Even things like the quick release skewers, we lubricate the actuation arm, we lubricate the threads, we lubricate the shaft to stop that sticking inside the wheel. And now we're just dealing with the chain set bolts themselves. We just a little bit of lubricant and grease on the actual chain set itself, just to stop it sticking in the future and corroding together. So now we can just begin the rebuild process of this part. Some of the other restorations we've done, the chrome absolutely pops out at you, but this was a sort of a selling point of this bike, was that it was black and white parts. They don't come up quite as nice as some of the old chrome, but even so, what a difference. So here we got the headset bearing sticking. You can see the rust on that top cap there. So we're going to deal with these. We're going to replace these headset bearings. We're going to clean up these cups and the retaining nuts and bolts and all the fittings there. We're going to put all those through the ultrasonic cleaner, give them a wire wool, and that headset will absolutely jump out when it's finished. So the old bearings, again, you can see they're not rusty, but they're just dry. The grease has dried out. It's gone hard. It's gone thick. They were probably slightly too tight when they were originally in there, which is why that handlebar was flicking itself and flicking back to its neutral position. It wasn't through wear, it was through dry bearings that were over tightened. So we'll deal with that as well. So a little bit of wire wool on these cups and around just the edge where it meets the frame. These parts into the ultrasonic cleaner. A little wash down after they've been through. I mean, look at the difference already just through going through the ultrasonic cleaner. There's no magic there. That is literally as they came out, and we've just washed them down. Forks as well, we just clean up the cups that are on the forks and around the edges that I can't get to once it's all back together for the wash down. Threads, give them a clean up. That'll make the world of difference to the way that adjustment and spin on of the headset bolts themselves will, how easy that will be to do. So in go new bearings, premium grease. It's a nice thicker grease without being too thick that it'll clog up. Lovely grease that we use there for the bearing work that we do. And you can see these forks will go back on and they will just spin and be so free compared with how they were. I mean, look at those parts already. What a huge difference just a little cleanup makes. On go to handlebars, we put them back in their original position, and look at that. They're now no longer sticking in their forward position, which means this bike will be free on the road. You'll be able to ride this with your hands off the handlebars rather than having to keep hold of them bars to steer it down the road. So that's a good step forward. Next up, this 6-speed block. We get this apart, get out all the old bearings, get out all the little spacers, and then we can put that through the ultrasonic cleaner and really in-depth clean that. If we put this all in as one part, we're going to flush out any grease or oil in the free hub itself. So that's what we're doing here. That was the little pulls and the little area there. All the various caps and spacers, they've all been through, all cleaned up, and now the actual cogs themselves, we can scrub those down because we haven't flushed out any oils from the bearings. So you can see there how lovely that's come up. Very little wear on that again, a little bit of corrosion, but not a lot. So we just put a little bit of grease on the threads, a little bit of free hub grease on the pores of the actual hub itself, and then again the premium grease, which, like I say, we use for all our bearings on the bearing race before we start to replace the bearings. The bearings I actually put into two little trays, one for the bottom race, one for the top race, so that I know I get the same amount of bearings back in there as what came out, and they're the same size and everything else. So I had two little trays of bearings so that I didn't get confused along the way. So you can see the second tray there, so I know that when that tray is empty I've got the right amount of bearings each side, because they had different amounts. So we count your bearings as they come out, count them as they go back in, and you've got that right, and then you just slip that back together. This is a little left-handed thread collar in there, and now that free hub is done, and next up we move to the wheel bearings themselves. So out come the axles. Again, that will all go through the ultrasonic cleaner, all clean up nicely. We'll clean up the cups inside the wheel there and put new bearings in. And the front wheel, when we were doing part of this bike, we spun the front wheel and it spun for an age. In fact, we were talking and I said to Simon, "God, look at that wheel still spinning." Way better than a modern bearing. It was incredible, really. So you can see there, look at the way that hub is beginning to come up now. You know, it looks like new there. Clean up the rims as well, clean up the spokes. The only thing really that was disappointing on this bike was the spokes themselves. They're galvanized steel and they just didn't come up quite nice. In an ideal world it would be lovely to rebuild these wheels, but as we've sort of mentioned in the past, these bikes are not my own bikes, they're not my own restoration. In this instance it wouldn't have been cost effective to have rebuilt both the wheels as well. So we stayed with what we had, and that's the nature of the work that we do. We present the best we can with what we've got in front of us. It's not always about doing absolutely every single part of the bike or every single part of a job that we'd like to. In this instance, the spokes were structurally sound, so there was no reason to redo them, and so that was why they were left. Next up, we've got new tyres. With an old bike like this, especially if it's sat for a few years and the tyres are showing perishing on the walls, the chances are the inner tube is as well. So in this instance we replaced both the tyres and the inner tubes. You can often inflate an old inner tube like this, but they are rubber, they do perish, and invariably they actually leak around the valve. So in this instance, new tyres, new tubes, that will make that safe when it's on the road. And now we're going to start on the cleaning up and detailing of the frame itself. So we use warm soapy water, we use a detailing brush, we use a soap wash. So that's initially what we're doing. We're just using the detailing brush. I'm actually using degreaser here because those little yellow patches are actually where someone has sprayed the components with a grease or an oil and it's blown onto the frame. So there's little grease marks on the frame itself, those yellow patches. So we actually just use a little bit of degreaser around that bottom edge. Same on these dropouts. You can see that yellowy and black. That's all through someone lubricating this bike during its lifespan. So we just degrease that, then we warm soap, we water it down with a detailing brush, wipe it off with a microfiber towel. That gives us our initial cleanup of the bike. The handlebar tape itself, again, we didn't replace that, it is the original tape. We bleached that, so we had a bleach sponge that we put on that. We just left that for a few minutes before we did the wash down, and now we've just washed the bike over with what we call our big softy brush. It's a nylon brush that's nice and free and easy and soft, and we wash down the frame before we then begin this process, which is T-cutting. So we use T-cut, it just wipes off road film, and you'll see on the left hand fork arm there, it will just get those little black marks off and get those down as far as we can. It will help clean off some of the yellowiness of the rust on the frame, and we just work our way front to back through the frame, through each of the triangles, cleaning those up with the T-cut. This is a laborious process, but well worth the effort on top of normal polishing, because it will just get off a lot of those little nitty-gritty marks without affecting the frame too badly. So once we've T-cutted it, we just again polish it off with a microfiber towel. We don't want to scratch the frame in any way because we are trying to make it shiny. And now I'm just using an Auto Glim Super Resin polish. Lovely creamy soft polish, this one. It's actually from the Carwell, but we bring it over to bikes, and it will just make that frame, it almost like moistens the frame. It makes it look lovely and shiny. Really makes a huge difference to a frame. Again, microfiber towel on, microfiber towel off, and you can see how that frame, the Rally logo there, how that's reflecting the light, looking beautiful. And then finally, with a restoration like this, we use the Rapid Ceramic Spray, and we'll work that all over the paint throughout the bike, and that will just give a little ceramic coating on the bike, which if the bike was to be used in the wet, it will just, or go through a puddle or anything like that, it'll just splash on the frame, and whatever splashes onto the frame won't stick to it, and that's the frame absolutely perfect, as near perfect as we can get it with what we're presented with. So next up, we now start the rebuild process. Always a great time. Really thrilled that these cups both came out. So we put the premium grease in, the bearings in, and then you'll see with this one I actually put an extra layer of grease over the top of these bearings, as you can see now. And the reason I do that is because obviously as I'm screwing these in, I'm battling gravity. So if I just put a little extra layer of grease on there, I can get those cups in without having to worry about the bearings dropping out and falling out and being a problem. The excess grease that just came off there, I just put on the threads, so that when I put this chain set back on, it just gives a little bit of lubricant to the threads and everything there, so there's no need to do those separately. So I just use the grease from the bottom bracket onto those. You'll also notice here that occasionally throughout this rebuild I use a torque wrench, where you'll see in other modern bikes where we run through a bike front to back with a torque wrench afterwards. A lot of these older bikes are all pinch bolts, done by hand, done by feel, and you don't actually need a torque wrench right the way through. But you can see the bolts that we can get to, we'll be actually torquing as we're doing it. And look at that spin, look at that. Oh, it's just amazing, isn't it, really? You know, when you compare that with a modern bottom bracket where that's all people talk about is the sort of the resistance, yet an old bike like this spins beautifully from the moment the bearings are put in. So it's amazing, really. So again, these, like you can see here, I use a screwdriver. There's no need to torque those up afterwards, it's all done by feel. And so there's very few bolts actually where we do use a torque, or less bolts on a job like this where we do use a torque wrench. So get all the gears on. So we'll get the chain set, front derailleur, rear derailleur, then we put the brakes on, then we'll put the wheels on, and then we'll adjust everything up as we go. And you'll just see, you would want to stick around for the before and afters on this bike, because it is astounding what a difference it made, really. We get a bit blinded when we're doing a job like this. We kind of film this over, you know, a few days. Simon will come in and we'll do a little session, and then he'll go and I'll carry on with normal work, and then he'll come back the next day and try and pick lighting in the shop and everything else. And we're quite in depth, you know, we're quite involved with these videos, we're quite passionate about it, and it's very easy to get blinkered by what you're doing and not realise just what a difference you're making to a bike like this. And when you see the before and afters, it is incredible, you know, and while we're doing it, we don't always notice. So you just see there, I just pulled the Park Tool cable through. That was to get the internal routed top tube out for the brake into the tube. And now we're just putting the new cables. We're using stainless steel, we use our super slick cables. The original cables in this bike were galvanised steel, and you'll notice that in the before and afters. The cables that were in the bike have all tarnished off, gone rusty in places. When we put these new stainless steel cables in, it makes a huge difference to the way a bike presents, just by giving that reflection of the beautiful stainless steel on the frame. Even the cables you pick can make a massive difference to a restoration like this without really changing any parts, just by freshening them up. Just makes a huge difference by just changing your cables to stainless steel. So we check the brakes, you can see we did the gear cables, check the brakes, get those tails the same length front to back. We just have a little guide cable there, you may have just noticed, which you'll see just here. When I cut this cable off, you'll see we use a little guide there, and that gives me the same length on each cable front and back without having to really measure them. And then the other thing we did do with this bike, this actually was the original saddle, but you can see the plastic covering has just deteriorated, it's just tearing off, the sponge underneath had deteriorated. So we did actually put a new saddle on this bike, which was kind of a shame. But if this was my bike, I think what I would do with it in this instance is I would then go onto eBay, would probably put in a search, and eventually at some point that saddle would pop up and you'd get your original saddle back on there. So you can see what a huge difference we've made to this bike. Look at these before and afters, the way this bike came up, the way it pops out at you, the way the frame cleaned up, the way these details here cleaned up, you know, even this headset bearing, look at that, what a difference. And this bike is absolutely ready to ride, it's got miles left in it now. So if you have enjoyed this video, do drop a comment, do drop a like. Simon spent hours on this one this time round, so if nothing else, drop a like on the video for him. Do hit the notification bell, you'll get notified when we bring out other videos. Do subscribe, we'd love to see the subscriber count go up. We thoroughly enjoy making these videos, especially this type of content. I am actually a real fanboy of this kind of work. This is absolutely me and my element. I really enjoy these sort of restorations. So once again, thanks for watching, and we will see you again next week. Bye for now.